What would you say to the survivor right now who has never told anyone what happened to her?
Whatever happened to you was bad enough. Oftentimes, as Asian women, we're taught to minimize or even be grateful that it could have been worse and it wasn't.
How do these stereotypes then make us more vulnerable to sexual assault or even microaggressions?
There's this idea that Asian women are always consenting, hypersexual, submissive, and this shows up in so many microaggressions. I think also one of the harmful consequences of these stereotypes is even the way that we as Asian women then internalize and even start to believe about ourselves, because it's depicted in the media, in movies, all of these places where we're just bombarded. We engage in this internalized misogyny or this self-objectification, where we start to believe our inherent worth is only derived from what we can do for others.
Do you have any advice around the conversations parents could have? Hi, Danielle. Thanks so much for joining us for this very important conversation today. Danielle, I am almost a 45-year-old woman who only recently recognized the sexual trauma that I experienced. And, I didn't grow up understanding boundaries, that my body is my body. And for a really long time, up until recently, I really thought it was my fault. I'm wondering from you, what would you say to the survivor right now who has never told anyone what happened to her?
That's a beautiful question. And I think I would start by saying that whatever happened to you was bad enough. Because oftentimes, and especially as Asian women, we're taught to minimize our problems or even be grateful that it could have been worse and it wasn't. And so to that, I say that if you are hurting and if you've been hurt, your pain is valid. And perhaps most importantly, that your trauma is never your fault.
Oh my gosh. That just honestly gave me chills when you said we're taught to minimize and to even be grateful that it wasn't worse. That just resonates so strongly. It makes me actually really sad. So first of all, thank you for validating our experience. I'd love to move into your research and work and have a discussion around colonialism and media and cultural narratives and how they have sort of shaped the way Asian women are perceived and treated. What are the most common racialized sexual stereotypes that are imposed on Asian women? And where did these come from?
Yeah, I will try my best to keep it concise. Yeah. But a term that I strongly believe I was put on this earth to share with everyone, to make more publicly known, because I do think it's lacking in, especially the way we approach mental health with Asian American women, imperialism. It is the idea of how sexual violence and rape is used as a weapon of colonization, particularly by Western forces in Eastern countries in Asia. And the first example of this was through militarized prostitution in the Philippines, when the U.S. colonized the Philippines after winning us from Spain. I put quotations around that. And how the treatment of Asian women, this degrading, dehumanizing treatment of Asian women, started through colonial conquest. Women are seen as the spoils of war, just in the way that land, resources, money, agriculture are also seen as the spoils of war. Women almost get dehumanized and objectified as this thing to be conquested over. And so with that history with U.S. militarized prostitution, I also think about, the bar girls in the Vietnam War. We see this sexual conquest in Japan, in the Philippines, in Thailand, in Vietnam, all over Asia. It created these racialized stereotypes, such as, the Lotus Blossom, the China doll, the dragon lady. Essentially, these ideas that Asian women are hypersexual, they're fetishized, they're seen as always consenting, always submissive.
And you're already starting to allude to this, but I'm curious to know, how do these stereotypes then make us more vulnerable to sexual assault? Or even a sexual, like a microaggression, like in the workplace, like an unwanted comment from a colleague.
Yeah, absolutely. I think because there's this idea that Asian women are always consenting, hypersexual, submissive, there's this idea that we always want sex. We have that. I forget what movie it is. If you remember, please correct me, please remind me. But, you have that scene of American GIs in Vietnam. And then there's this Vietnamese woman who approaches them and goes, "Me so horny, me love you long time." And even how that very disparaging phrase has almost become ubiquitous in our society, the way we throw it around, even to be humorous, to be funny, not knowing how rooted that is in, sexual violence, in colonial sexual violence. We see this being reinforced in pornography,
Mm.
where in most examples of violent pornography, the victim is an Asian woman and the perpetrator, more often than not, is a white man. And even how that further perpetuates the stereotype that we are always consenting, that we are always submissive. And so there's even this idea, drawing from that Asian women can't even be raped because, again, we are seen as always consenting. And this shows up in so many microaggressions. I've been approached by white men who are like, where are you from? Oh, you're so maganda. I love Filipino women. Filipino women are my favorite. They're so nice. They're so sweet. My wife is Filipina. And yeah, the underlying message behind that is Asian women are so sweet. They're so giving. They're so generous. They're so passive and submissive.
It's true, Danielle. Like I can recount things said to me very similarly to what you just shared. And it's like I could be in a business suit and someone can say something, but the liberty to just say it always shocks me because I showed up in a business suit. I'm here to network or I'm here to engage in an intellectual conversation with somebody at a conference. So hearing you recount the history, how deep the history is around how these stereotypes, these images were cultivated and then how they come ashore to American soil, it helps me to understand how deep the thinking around that really is.
I think also one of the harmful consequences of these stereotypes is even the way that we as Asian women then internalize and even start to believe this about ourselves. Because if we're hearing it so often, if it's depicted in the media, in movies, in all of these places where we're just being bombarded with this idea that all Asian women must be hypersexual, must be passive and submissive, we engage in this internalized misogyny or this self-objectification where we start to believe that our worth, our inherent worth, is only derived from what we can do for others, what we can do particularly for men, if that means reducing ourselves to just an object and my value only comes from what I can sexually provide or even what I can emotionally provide through like emotional labor or like domestic housework. And it's so sad that because of how ubiquitous this messaging is, how we start to believe it ourselves.
Why is verbal or physical sexual violence, why is it so invisible and silenced within our own community? Because as you're talking about the stereotypes and the way it's perpetuated and the way that we are internalizing it, I mean, I'm getting pissed sitting here and learning about this. And can you help us understand why don't we talk about this as a community, as a broader Asian community?
I'm certain there are multiple layers that contribute to this culture of silence. One of the first aspects I think of is how, unfortunately, we're a very shame based culture. We use shame as a sense of like motivation, a sort of like keeping people in line socially. It can be used effectively to promote collectivism, serving your family. But something I often tell clients is that shame is a fuel that burns bright but burns dirty. And particularly in the case of sexual violence, when we exist in this culture that often blames women for their traumas, what were you wearing? Were you drinking too much? Did you fight back hard enough? Like, did you even say no? Because of that shame that is tied to that victim blame, it obscures survivors into silence, where they are afraid that if they were to speak out about the trauma, share this with their family, that they would be shamed, that they would be blamed and like ostracized. I think especially how sexual violence can also be very normalized in our culture. When I think about the very hierarchical, patriarchal family structure because of either Confucianism, also Christianity also inhabits these patriarchal structures. There's this idea that sexual violence, especially, for example, between husband and wife, is not even a thing.
Yeah.
Where that is just the duty of the wife to provide sex to the husband. That, marital sexual violence isn't even a thing. So that can contribute to the silence. And I think one of the last things is when I think about intergenerational trauma, the traumas that our ancestors experienced, that our parents have experienced, either immigrating to the US or, fleeing war, concentration camps, whatever it is. There's so much silence around trauma. And I think a lot of it is because it's a survival mechanism where to talk about the trauma means reliving it, means re-experiencing the pain. And it becomes easier to forget about it, push it aside, forget that it ever happened, not talk about it, because it's a survival tool. And in that sense, there's a sense of compassion or sympathy that by denying your trauma or doing that to survive, but perhaps at the expense of, psychological pain, isolation, loneliness, shame. Yeah, I think those factors make it so difficult to talk about, and why these conversations don't often happen in our community.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that it's even hard for women to disclose. Just thinking about my own experience, just to say it out loud. Why is that so challenging for Asian women to do that?
Yeah. That reminds me, even of my own experience as a survivor, where I had talked to my assailant the following day, and we were weirdly counting the experience. And I had shared, I didn't really want that. Like, I hope you understand, I wasn't into that. I, didn't want this. And he even said, "Oh, so you're saying I raped you?" And at the time, my response was, "No, I'm not saying that. Like, why would you say that? Like, that's not true." Like, pure denial could not, stomach the reality that is what happened, could not even name the trauma that I experienced. And to this day, I don't know if that was wanting to protect this person that I thought I loved. I think about our collectivist culture where we want to protect other people. We see each other as like a community. Of course, we would not want to think that a friend or our father or an uncle or like a family member would ever do that to us, given, our family ties. I think there's also, again, the survival piece where to name the trauma would make it more real, and perhaps our brains, our souls aren't ready for that level of heaviness. And also perhaps the fact that because we don't talk about sexual violence, because even like marital sexual violence sometimes even isn't even seen as a thing, I wonder if we even have the capacity to acknowledge when sexual violence is sexual violence, if we were never taught to recognize it.
I mean, there's so much going on in there. Even when you talk about how, there's the shame around it that we experience, that we have learned to not talk about this, but there's also this sense of collectiveness. I feel like that's going to help so many people. And that so resonated just with my own experience, so that there's a protective component to it that I've had to just work through in therapy personally. But the knee-jerk reaction to say, to deny it to ourselves, but then to also protect the assailant. Like there's so many layers to this. There's so much unpeeling. I feel like I had to do personally. I'm wondering other women have to do in order to come to this sort of, no, my body is my body. And no one is entitled to it. Could you speak to the role of intergenerational trauma? We've talked a little bit, and refugee and or immigrant family dynamics. How does that shape how we as a community respond to violence?
Yeah, I would say on one hand, this idea of a culture of silence, how, experiencing intergenerational trauma often goes either we don't talk about it, it's very like hush hush. You don't want to upset your parents or upset Lola by asking her about the war or asking about this trauma. There's this phrase in Tagalog that's like bahala na, which essentially means like it's done, like let it go, give it to God. And on one hand, it can be as a form of resilience, but on the other hand, it's saying, don't talk about this. Why would you want to bring up something that's so troubling that we've already survived? We're like, we're here now, we're good now. Why would you want to touch that ever again? And of course, that creates this psychological pain that not only just affects our bodies, affects our souls, but I believe that intergenerational trauma can be passed down to our children, to the future generations in other ways. Like I think about for those who have survived poverty or survived war, we often inhabit these like scarcity mindsets. I think about like my parents hoarding every plastic bag or being punished for not finishing everything on your plate.
Yeah.
which we honor as like, hey, these were the things that helped our parents survive.
Yeah.
And we may not see it as intergenerational trauma, but it's, these tools that like helped our parents survive their wars, their pain, their traumas. And then we as a later generation get to decide, what do I want to pass on? What do I want to keep? Of course, those are pretty gentle examples, but I also think of the intergenerational trauma of like shame, of very critical parents who are perhaps parenting from a place of fear. They tell their children that, oh, you have to have this career, you have to make this much money. If you don't, like, you're ruined, you're a failure. Obviously, it hurts to be told that. But we see it as, again, intergenerational trauma, our parents saying, we don't want you to suffer the way that we suffered.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps not delivered in the best way,
Yeah.
but, is what they knew, doing the best with the survival tactics that they were given.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's so true. I love the way that you frame. It's like you are acknowledging what the previous generations went through. And there's also space to say what's serving us now as a culture. I have a daughter and I think about this all the time. I'm a work in progress, Danielle. This is not something that I have sorted out, but as mom, I want my daughter and my sons to know that their body is their body and they're young, they're elementary age kiddos. And while I can control as a parent or a caregiver or even an aunt, I can control what happens in my own household and the messaging I give my kids around their bodies. Do you have any advice around the conversations parents could have?
I wonder if even just the act of opening the conversation, especially how hush-hush these conversations tend to be.
Yeah.
I certainly wasn't given a very thorough birds and the bees conversation or even a conversation about autonomy over my body. I was never told that my body is my own and that I get to say whatever, I get to do whatever I want with my body. So to even just open these conversations, to create spaces where open dialogues can happen, where a child can feel safe enough to go to their parent and say like, ooh, I feel uncomfortable around this person, or I don't like when this person touches me. I don't want to give hugs to my grandma just because she's my grandma. To even assert that bodily autonomy, to start that at a young age. I love that you are telling your children, even now, that like their body is their body. We have this like, again, this beautiful, this bittersweet collectivist culture where, of course, we love our family, we respect our elders. But to even say that, like, hey, you can say no to grandma if you don't want to give her a hug.
Oh, man, that's powerful.
And, you don't have to be in the room with this uncle or with this person if he makes you uncomfortable. And to know that you have that advocate, that parent that you can go to, who will not shame you, who will not blame you, who will not punish you just for expressing your concerns, for opening these dialogues.
Holy moly, Danielle, that you just gave us an amazing concrete strategy, like so contextualized in I think about my Asian culture and yes, hugging elders. That's a very concrete skill that I can take away and implement literally tomorrow. And communicating to my child around your body is your body. You don't have to give a hug if it doesn't feel right to you. And the permission to maintain autonomy over something that could feel very harmless. It's just a hug. But if you can say no to grandma with a hug, wow, that is powerful. And I just love that you said that. And then you said starting the conversation. Maybe that's the hardest part for us. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be in alignment with like whatever gentle parenting theory or the right thing to say when it comes to the birds and the bees. By the way, I never got that talk either. I didn't know how babies were made even going into college. Oh my God. Seriously, it's a true story. But just starting and stumbling through it and maybe just being honest about it. I think I so appreciate you saying that because it's true. We just have to start, not just in our own family, but in our broader community. Just start having that conversation. That's generational and pattern disruption right there. That's huge. What is culturally attuned, trauma-informed care. What does that actually look like for Asian women?
Absolutely. And I think the unfortunate thing is that we don't have a clinical definition because the research is still being put out there. We're still in the very preliminary stages of developing culturally attuned decolonial care for Asian American women, for the Asian diaspora in general. I first want to talk about what it is not. And
Okay.
when I think about what is not, I think about traditional Western therapy. And I think a big aspect that Western therapy lacks is community support and integrating our collectivism, our strength as a community. I think often Western therapy is so focused on the individual. Like, you experienced this trauma, therefore you need to go to therapy, you need to do the work, you need to take these tools, implement them in your daily life. What Western therapy lacks and what we can use as a strength for our community is to engage in collective communal healing. I think especially when sexual trauma is so shameful, and shame causes us to isolate, it causes us to retreat in ourselves. We don't want to be blamed, we don't want to be seen as dirty. I think one of the remedies to that is to put yourself back into community. I don't know if that means engaging in like survivor support groups, perhaps like specifically targeted towards Asian women.
The support groups, and actually you led a support group through the Asian Mental Health Project,
Yes.
right? You co-facilitated that. And I think that you're right. It's so important to plug yourself into community.
Absolutely. I think it's in those communities where we get to talk about the cultural stigma, the shame, the lack of conversations within our family that dismantle these gender roles, dismantle these stigmas around sexual violence, to even know that you're not alone in that sense of being alone. And I think it's in community that we also get to address the deep layers of shame associated not only with sexual trauma, but also like our culture.
Yeah.
That was a point of my research that came up, is like, how do we address this shame? How do we undo the layers of shame that's tied to self-blame as survivors, the cultural shame of not feeling good enough in our family because we're not the doctor, we didn't get good grades, or whatever it is, on top of the shame of sexual violence, like seeing ourselves as dirty, as violated, our bodies are not our own. I think Brene Brown has great research around shame and how shame causes you to isolate, and so therefore the antidote is a sense of belonging, a sense of belonging in community.
Absolutely. I agree with you. I think it is. It's so important to be connected. It's almost like when you say it out loud, it takes away the shame. When I declare it,
Absolutely.
and I reclaim it, and and I can connect with others, it takes that stigma away. And when you are connected to people, let's say it's like specifically like an Asian support group for survivors of sexual trauma, it feels like it's a relief to not have to explain to somebody. I didn't have an emotional connection with my family. That was not the dynamic of my family. I didn't get that talk. I didn't know this. And then culturally, we just don't talk about, there's just so much that could go unsaid that feels
Absolutely.
like less emotional labor almost in a conversation of people who might understand culturally where you're coming.
Absolutely. Which I think is also, raises the idea of like having a therapist for the shared identity, having someone who comes from the same diaspora, shares the same culture experience, because you don't have to explain in detail all of these cultural nuances because they already get it. Of course, Asian American identity is not a monolith. We all come from different backgrounds.
Yeah.
We are a heterogeneous group.
Yeah.
But there are shared experiences among our community. And to be able to just feel seen and to feel accepted, to not feel shamed through being seen, I think that in and of itself is a powerful healing mechanism, to be accepted, to be in front of a therapist or even a friend, a family member who sees you, who does not shame you, who tells you it's not your fault.
Yeah.
That relational connection can be so powerful.
Absolutely. I'm curious, how can we better support survivors in our own families or friend groups, even if we don't know all of the details?
I think one of the greatest things that we can offer survivors is the reassurance that it's not their fault and that it's never their fault. I think we're so inundated with these messages of rape culture, or rather like rape myth acceptance, that these questions are like, what were you wearing? What were you drinking? What were you doing out so late? That to just banish all of those questions, all of those lines of thinking, and to reaffirm, like, this is not your fault. You did not deserve this. And then I think, again, just being offered community. So I am a sexual assault survivor. I'm also a physical assault survivor. And following that traumatic experience, the way that my community just wrapped around me and, not only asserted like, this is not your fault that this happened, but for friends to be like, can I bring you a meal? Do you need help like picking up your medication? Can I get your groceries? Or can I cook for you? Can I just be around you so you're not alone? And to offer a listening ear, to just hold your friend, your community, physically, emotionally. Again, healing is not done in isolation. It is done through being loved, through being surrounded by community, and even just that physical presence to know that you are not alone.
It is important to accept help. As I have learned over the years, it's really hard for me to accept that help, even when it is extended. But I think that that's such a beautiful gesture. It doesn't have to be sitting with someone and listening, and maybe you're nervous about, you don't have the tools or the skills, and I can even feel the perfectionism coming out in me right now as we speak. But I can make a meal for someone, or I can offer to go pick up a prescription. And that is just as important in building community and wrapping your arms around a survivor. That could be arguably just as important as even being that listener as well.
Especially in a culture that has such negative help-seeking behavior, that's a clinical term. We're not inclined to ask for help. We have this idea that we're supposed to save face, suffer in silence, sort of figure it out as you go. It's not bad enough. You can sort this out on your own. You can figure this out. That perhaps even just like bypassing, waiting for the survivor or waiting for your friend to ask for help, just already offering it, knowing how hard it is to ask for help, and to even invite that ask, to say that like you are not weak because you need help, or you're not a failure because you need help. Like, we all need help. We all need community. What's the point of being in a collectivist culture if we're not, being in our community, using our community? It takes a village.
That is so true. It is. It's almost like we're very collectivist. And so why not leverage that when you need it most in those moments of healing? Danielle, what do you wish our community understood about sexual violence and healing?
I feel like I can't say it enough, that it is never the survivor's fault. And so I know I've drilled that home like repeatedly again and again. I think another aspect that I would, if I could leave listeners or like leave our community with another takeaway, is to understand all of the systems at play, or all of the systems that are at play when it comes to sexual violence. Not only do we have this violent history of colonization, of white sexual imperialism that causes more vulnerability to sexual violence, the way that Asian women are more vulnerable to sexual violence. And, we see this in the media. Because I was writing this research paper just days after the Atlanta spa shooting. And so we're seeing this concurrently, this vulnerability to sexual violence. And so not only is there that historical aspect at play, but there's also racial hegemony, gender-based violence, patriarchy at play, this sort of sense of entitlement that is often breeded through patriarchal culture. When we take this like larger systemic view of sexual violence, I think that not only displaces blame off of the survivor, but also it gives us a mission. It gives us a purpose and a sort of battle to fight against. Like, of course, we want to dismantle these oppressive systems that continue to perpetuate harm, normalize violence, normalize oppression for women and other femmes. And so I want to even integrate that like zoomed out lens to this phenomenon, and know that it is not just the survivor and the assailant, but much broader systems that are also at play and continue to perpetuate these violent cycles.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's such a, what the big takeaway, at least I'm walking away from this conversation of so many, first of all, but one of the big ones is that there's so much at play There's like the macro systems that are at play in terms of teaching us the way Asian women are stereotyped and how that impacts us and how that makes us more vulnerable. There's the cultural aspect of how we talk about this even in our own community, in our own family. And then there's like the internalization. I mean, there's just so much happening and so much education. And for that, we're so grateful that you have really broken this down for us. Danielle, what gives you hope for the future when it comes to breaking these cycles and these stigmas?
I love this question. This sounds very corny as a therapist, but I think one of my biggest sources of hope is my clients. And of course, this is it's emotionally taxing job. It's grueling, exhausting a lot of the time. But to see my clients not only foster hope for themselves, to have that revelation that it was never their fault, they are not to blame, that there is hope and healing outside of their traumas, that their traumas do not define them. That brings me hope, as well as going back to earlier in our conversation, I see them wanting to break those intergenerational patterns, wanting to break those cycles of silence by engaging in these conversations for themselves. They go in saying, I love my parents. I acknowledge what they had to do to survive. And when I have my own kids, I'm going to start these conversations. I'm going to break these patterns. My children will want for nothing. They will not have to live in fear, or they will not have to perpetuate these scarcity mindsets. Just seeing that willingness to break those intergenerational patterns gives me so much hope for what we are doing as a collective, what our future generations will hopefully not have to suffer through. And that really inspires me to know that the work is being done and we are all together in this collective fight, not only for women's safety, but also rewriting the cultural narratives for our Asian community.
Danielle, thank you for this powerful conversation. For our listeners who want to learn more from you, where can they find you? And are there any exciting projects that, oh my gosh, your PhD, in addition to that, is there anything that you would love to share with our listeners? How can we find you? How can we connect with you? And what are you doing in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am available. My website is danielletherapy.com. I'm also on Instagram at Danielle Therapy. I am accepting clients on a limited basis if folks are based in California. But in terms of what I'm working on towards the future, of course, I am in a PhD program. That is grueling, that is exhausting. Since my last work focused on Asian American survivors' experiences of racialized sexism, I'm taking that idea of racialized sexism and expanding that to other avenues, looking at it from different lenses. And so right now I'm working on understanding the experiences of internalized racialized sexism. So the idea of how do we as Asian women internalize these beliefs of ourselves. I am specifically looking at Filipino American women. I'm also looking at Vietnamese American women, given their experiences of bar girls and during the Vietnam War. I also co-facilitate the Asian Women and Femmes, a peer wellness circle through Asian Mental Health Project. That is ongoing. Those are free. Right now we're on a monthly summer schedule, but it's usually every other week that we meet. It's a free community. Anyone can drop in at any time. We talk about great conversations like racialized sexism, like cultural stigmas, like intergenerational trauma.
That's incredible. And you really are one of the super women of our community. And for that, so as a mom, I'm so grateful for you, the thinking that you are bringing forth into this field to support Asian women. And I'm just so grateful to be in conversation with you today. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Courage Class. I hope today's conversation gave you a little encouragement and inspiration. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And for extra motivation, tools, and behind-the-scenes content, sign up for my newsletter. I'd love to share with you more there. See you next time.